that I really wanted to do this because I really value the opportunity to speak to game designers and developers. And it's nice to get outside of my academic bubble, you know, because we just talk to each other. And sometimes it's really nice to talk to people that can actually produce change in a very visible way. So thank you. All right, so a lot of my work, I guess I'm kind of the weird lady that works on nature in video games. So that's like a very simple description of what I do. And I know, even for you all, video games are probably not the first place that you go to look for nature or nature communion, but I really think that video games and games in general have been overlooked as ways to influence environmental perception and attitudes and knowledge, and also just as an index or a barometer of where we are as a culture and our response to environmental problems and crisis. And as you know already, millions of people play games. They spend billions of hours playing them. So to me, it seems like a no-brainer that it's very important to think about what kinds of environmental content and messages are being communicated through games, even if it's not explicit, right? If it's just implied. And so we'll be thinking about that today, I hope. Okay. So really, you know, games are a way for us to think about what is our place in the world, what is our relationship to the world and the species that we share it with, right? Is it my cute planet or my fair planet, a cute planet? Is it something else? So in many ways, I wrote this book, Playing Nature, which you'll see in a second. It grew out of a series of frustrations that I had. I just got kind of irritated with game environments that I think are really beautiful. They're lush spectacles, right? But they're very mechanically limited. Or game environments where the environment is really, it's essentially an infinite stockpile of resources, right, for player use. And it's not to say that these are bad games, right, but that I wanted different kinds of player environment interaction as a player. And I sometimes design games, but I primarily am a critic and a player, right? And when I was in grad school, one of my friends who now teaches actually at Sciences Po, she said, oh, you should really read this book, Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. And in it, Richard Louv, he basically says anybody that was born from the 70s onward has nature deficit disorder, kind of like attention deficit disorder. And so basically saying that we don't have enough nature in our blood or something, right? And so, the quote here says, nature offers something that the street or the gated community or a computer game cannot. And so I'm a little bit sympathetic because I'm a parent to an 8-year-old. So I get it, I understand where he's coming from, but I'm also a little bit annoyed as somebody who loves games and also teaches media, including games. I just think it's a little bit binary, right? Like nature is on one side, technology is on the other. And it makes it sound like there's not anything we can learn from technology or from mediation of nature. And that seems wrong. Okay. So this is the cover of my book. You might recognize the games that are pictured here. So the book became my way of trying to answer this question. Can games offer as meaningful a natural experience as going outdoors? And notice I say meaningful, not as natural, because I know that would be impossible. And I think many different disciplines could help to answer this question. But just because, of my background, I particularly leaned on the sciences. So I'm interested in ecology. I used to be an English professor, so I also talk a lot about literature and also about media. And I've also just tried to read up on the social science and some of the environmental education. And it turns out there's actually a lot of evidence for the beneficial properties of mediated exposure to nature, right? Even though direct exposure to nature, like actually going into the forest or into the woods, might be more powerful, but you still get a lot of benefit from interacting with virtual or simulated experiences of nature. And you could also argue that those experiences are more practical. Not everybody can just go into the national park or has the money to, buy all the backpacking equipment and go into the woods for 2 weeks, right? So I think games are really just, again, it's a neglected resource that we should take more advantage of. So in the book, I try to sort of just figure out what is it that games are uniquely good at, right? That they're very well suited to communicating some of these environmental or ecological principles and worldviews. And as you'll see in a second, I use these one-word terms that I borrowed from other disciplines to think about this. And I'm just going to go really quickly because I have so much to cover. But I start with this concept, Mesocosm, which is really a scientific term. And the reason I use a science term is because I started to really feel like what we do as game players is a lot like what scientists do when they're designing experimental enclosures, or what you do as game designers. It's very similar, right? You're trying to explore or design a system, and you're getting players to figure out how it works. And a mesocosm in science is an experimental enclosure that is somewhere in the middle between the full complexity of reality and the very simple like laboratory setup, like a tank, like an aquarium tank in the lab, right? So Dr. Berger gave me this image. These are marine mesocosms in Western Norway that are run by the University of Bergen. And so you can see there are 12 of them that are floating on the surface, and the water can actually go through the barrier into the enclosure so that you get some reality. And then on the right, up here, is an overhead view of a forest fragment in the Amazon, where scientists have, for decades, they've been studying the effects of burning and deforestation and the effect that, making those edges has on the health of the forest and the species in it. And so for me, games are a lot like these mesocosms, right? Because they try to let in enough reality to make things really interesting, but they also have to set boundaries, right? So it doesn't become chaos. So it's all about the design process of what am I including and what am I leaving out? And also what scientists call it edge effects, the effects that are produced by the edges of your simulation, right? And so games also have that same problem where you have to deal with the effects of creating those edges, right? And so I use mesocosms to talk about games that are very site-specific, like Colossal Cave Adventure. It's an old text game, some of you might know, but the designer who made it, it's not this guy. It's another guy, but Will Crowther, he was really passionate about exploring caves in his spare time, and he also was very passionate about playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, right, when it first came out. And so the game really incorporates both. And people say if you're a really good player of adventure, you could go to these caves in Kentucky in the United States and navigate through them. I wouldn't try it, but that's kind of interesting, right? And then another game that's very site-specific is Firewatch, which is supposed to be the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming in the United States. And what I find interesting is the game is great, but also the Campo Santos research process for this game involved actually going on camping trips, because not all of their developers had ever gone camping, right? So part of it was also, we have to go camping, we have to also look at the maps inside the US Forest Service archive to try to get the look and the feel of this game right. And I find that really interesting. The other term I use in the book is scale. So, I think scientists are very aware that when it comes to scale, humans, we tend to measure everything against us, even if it doesn't make sense to do that, right? It's a very terrestrial, human-sized bias, right? And so for me, games like this one, this is Everything by David O'Reilly, or Spore, or Katamari Damacy. Those kinds of games, they help us to break out of the human level bias, right? And to think at different scales. And so in this game, you might have tried it. You can be very small, you can be pollen or atoms, all the way up to huge things, right? Like galaxies. And scale is not just about space, it's also about time, which is a very important environmental way of thinking. It's like thinking beyond the present, also to the very distant future, right? Generations from now, or thinking into the distant past. And I think games allow us to do this quite well. The next term that I think is also critical is kind of the point where the book changes a little bit. It's the non-human or the more than human. And this is where I think about a lot of philosophy written about animals and plants, and even about geology, to think again about the way that we as humans, we tend to form attachments to things that are artificially intelligent, right? And there's an MIT psychologist, Sherry Turkle, who has studied mostly kids, but not just kids, how kids are very willing to bond and to form attachments to things like dolls that talk or very simple animated toys. So did anybody ever have a Tamagotchi or a Furby? Yeah. Okay. So she shows that, even very simple things that ask us to care for them have very powerful impacts on us, right? And can make us feel these feelings of responsibility or empathy. And why not to, think about this in terms of games? There are many games now that, or more, not many games that would let us play as non-humans, like Mountain, or I don't know, Shelter, the games by the Swedish studio Might and Delight. I think the earlier ones you played as a badger or a lynx, and then the most recent one, you're an elephant matriarch. They even have an MMO version of this. And so this chapter really starts to show that ecology is nice, but it only gets you so far because it's very systems oriented. It's about systems thinking, and that's useful up to a point. But then at some point, you also have to think about matters of feeling and emotion and experience. And people who study climate change communication know this very well, right? Facts, just showing somebody the facts only gets you so far, right? That's not necessarily going to change their minds. You also have to also change get to their hearts. And so the final chapters are about entropy and collapse, and it sounds very depressing. But I promise it actually ends on a hopeful note. And so, this is using stuff from thermodynamics. And entropy, this chapter is kind of about all the things that we sort of take for granted and we don't tend to show in games, like waste or failure or labor, disorder. And we often do this in real life too. We make it invisible because it makes us uncomfortable. But, in many ways, failure is central to gameplay. We could talk about that later. But, in this category, you can think about, there are a lot of games that I think if you're actually doing well, you should feel a little weird. Like maybe something's wrong. And this game, Farmtown, was before Farmville. No one remembers it. But at level 4, I don't know if you can read it. I remember laughing because I was only level 4, but I could have an open pit mine alongside a breakfast restaurant. And I thought, that's strange. I can have a factory and a pit mine, and it's only level 4. And then also this very famous one by Mole Industria phone story that was, designed to be played on your phone. So it really implicated you in the process of, resource extraction that leads to, digital devices. So in this game, if you haven't seen it, there are 4 levels, and you basically are doing all sorts of unethical things, like you're overseeing child labor in the Congo. You're trying to prevent Foxconn factory workers in China from leaping to their deaths because of terrible working conditions. You're throwing phones to angry customers who are trying to get into the store, and then you're processing toxic e-waste in the third world. And so when you do well at these games, you actually kind of don't feel good about it. And I think that's really interesting, right? Okay. And then the final term, collapse, is kind of an ecological term. And I think games can address collapse in many different ways, in many different genres. So you can imagine everything from something like Stardew Valley, which has this narrative about corporate greed, like Joja, like down with Joja, or maybe you like Joja, I don't know. To like Ubisoft's game From Dust, where you're always trying to defend your civilization against natural disasters. And it really kind of makes you feel or reflect on vulnerability to natural forces, or at least that's what I felt. All the way to simulation games like Spore, or maybe Sim Earth, that's kind of old, but the sim games, right? It's a little more scientific or mathematical, but all different kinds of genres can make you reflect on collapse. And I think it's really productive to be a player and to play a game and to be the agent of some kind of collapse and then have to deal with the aftermath, right? So not just causing collapse, but also having to live with it afterward, right? That's something we all need to do at this point. And so maybe the surprising thing here is that I'm not just arguing that to make good environmental games, you have to make serious games that are about saving the planet or recycling or, you know, like turning lights off, that kind of thing, like green nudges. But I actually think that, you know, even destructive play can be really instructive, right? If destruction is leading you to think about, how did I do that? What happened afterward? And how does that, you know, how do I relate to other species, other places as this is happening? And the thing about Spore that's interesting, Will Wright is obviously a very famous game designer. He has an office in Berkeley, California, where I went to school. So, you know, he famously demoed this game at a TED Talk, and he basically changed one variable really dramatically on a planet, like he warmed the atmosphere to the point where he created global warming, basically, and then eventually the surface of the planet burst into flame, right? And the planet became uninhabitable. And that was like his thought experiment to show you what Spore could do. But from talking to him, I also have learned that even the very popular game The Sims, which is all about, people say it's a virtual dollhouse, is actually much more ecological than you think, because the people in The Sims are actually more like ants in Sim Ant, his other game. So they don't have agency. Like, they're not so much agents as they are responding to environmental factors. So they might be in a state of hunger, and the refrigerator is emitting food pheromones, like scents, and then the sim responds to that. So I think that's really interesting, right? To think about how the ultimate human dollhouse game is actually more an environmental game than we thought, right? Okay, and then, you know, as part of Collapse, I do think researchers have shown that a lot of your adult environmental attitudes are based on what you experienced as a child, right, of nature, whether it's mediated or unmediated. And a lot of it is particularly strong is if there was a favorite place that you had as a child that was later lost or destroyed, that has a really strong impact on adults. And I actually, the researchers talk about this in terms of real world places, but I think this can be true in games as well. And that's why I had World of Warcraft Cataclysm up there earlier. I think this holds true even for places we may not have directly experienced, like the ice caps that are disappearing, right? Or there's this, has anybody played Viridi, where you take care of a little pot of succulents? And I always thought, there's no way I can kill these, right? No, I could leave for months and I would come back and I could still water them and they would grow, but they changed the programming. So recently when I went to check on my plants, they were dead. And I actually had to start over. And that was very surprising and actually kind of interesting to me. Like, oh no, I kind of feel terrible that I've killed these plants. Okay, so, you know, the book came out around 2.5 years ago. And since then, I've really spent more time thinking about the context of the games industry. So sustainability of production, use, and disposal. And so if Playing Nature was mostly about ecology in games, this more recent work, it's about ecology of games. And, you know, I do think we have to acknowledge that the games industry has a footprint, right? And there are environmental impacts of production. There are a lot of, now a lot, not used to be, but there are a lot of studies now about media industries and their footprint, like Hollywood, right? There are some for games. I know these are going by very quickly, so if you have questions, I'm happy to share slides afterward. But I really want to point out this one, which just came out a few months ago. Ben Abraham, some of you might know, wrote this book called Digital Games After Climate Change. And he actually used to be an academic, but he's now a consultant for the games industry. So you can actually just email him if you have questions or if you want him to come talk to your company. But, you know, this is really thinking about how do we make the industry better, and how do we create an industry that we're proud to work with, to be part of, and that will be sustainable. in all senses of that word for the future, something that we can continue to do, right? And so part of acknowledging these realities, I teach a lot of students at the university. A lot of them love to play games. And so I like to kind of be a little bit depressing and just tell them things like Nintendo, who, if you think about it, their games are very popular because of these beautiful worlds, right? And they're very family friendly. But when Greenpeace, the environmental organization, first started to evaluate game companies on their guide to greener electronics, this was back in 2006, 2007, Nintendo is right here. It got a 0 out of 10, right? It was the worst report card of all of the companies. I mean, Microsoft was not that much better. But the evaluator was trying to be nice. That said, it leaves infinite room for future improvement. So it did get better, but I like to tell them that, right? And then also, I tell them stuff that you probably already know, that the resources, the minerals and elements that go into hardware, all digital devices, right? As one of my colleagues likes to say, we all carry bits of Africa around in our pockets, right? This is a mining operation in the Congo, and coltan and things like that have led to years of armed conflict across 8 African nations, many different militias. There's e-waste, well, they call it recycling, but it's really still very toxic to the people that are processing it. And the waste is going from places like France and the US to places like China and India to be recycled. And I do think we also need to talk about data centers. My husband is a network engineer, so I get to knock on data centers. And I think, these are very kind of boring, anonymous looking buildings that are usually built near water or in colder places, right? And they have thousands of servers in them that are being used for internet and cloud services like Facebook or Amazon or Google. This is a Google data center in Finland. And I recently just finished a chapter on cloud gaming with the late Jeff Watson, he was a game designer who taught at University of Southern California and passed away. But we wrote about cloud gaming and how the industry really would like you to believe that this is more flexible. It's liberating, players from their devices and making it less material. But actually, what we say is that, cloud gaming is really still very much tied to boxes, right? To devices that are using energy. And in fact, it uses more in some ways. And it really depends on a lot of factors. But we come up with this term infrastructures of play. And really, infrastructure can mean anything from data centers to power plants to the climate of the Earth itself. And I'm going to explain that in a second. Okay, sorry, sad cloud. The reason why cloud gaming might potentially be a lot worse is because it's relying on constant cross-network communication of high information assets, right? And we don't have a lot of data on this yet. There's some data, but for streaming, things like Netflix, they've done a little bit more studying. And one account says that streaming already accounts for 1% of global greenhouse emissions. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you want to compare, Shell, the oil company, is also estimated at about 1% of global emissions, right? And this is, the estimates are that this will just drastically increase, right? So one estimate is that by 2030, data centers will use 3 to 13% of global electricity. And then what scares me about that is that the range is so huge. Like, people don't really know, right? 3 to 13, that's like a big range. Okay. And like I said, there's all the kind of equity questions too, right? So cloud gaming is the future of gaming, but for who, right? It's really for people who already have reliable internet access and electricity, and what about everybody else? Okay, so at this point I have to always stop and say I really do love games. I'm not telling people to stop making them or playing them, or like throw your PlayStation in the river. Don't do that, right? But I do want us to make games and play games with our eyes open to see that these factors are involved. And one way we can do this is to change our viewpoint to actually acknowledge this. So my colleague Laura Marks, she says we should start to think about streaming something at high resolution as being a lot like eating a steak in a restaurant, right? And that really is like, we're not trained to think this way, right? We don't sit down and watch Netflix and think, oh my God, I'm I'm consuming something that is the end product of a very resource intensive set of choices, right? Of land and energy use. But this is kind of one way we can start to think about things, or we can fight about it in Q&A. But in addition to changing our frame of mind, we could also start to think practically, right? How can we maybe impose design constraints, low tech, whatever it is, like on file size or streaming bit rate? And there are people who are working on this. There's something called the Small File Media Festival. This was last year, so actually this year is going to be the third version of it. And when they started, they actually limited file sizes to 5 megabytes. 5 megabytes. And then later they said, okay, there will be a binge-worthy category where you can go up to 22 megabytes. But even with that, the streaming can only be at 1 megabyte per minute. So they're setting very deliberate constraints and trying to say small is beautiful, right? And how can you make something that's pleasing but also more energy conscious? All right, now this is the ugliest slide ever. I'm so sorry. But you can say we're doing science or something. I'm sorry. This is kind of my version of a book called Gaming by Alex Galloway that came out in 2006, where he was trying to like figure out what is it, the relationship between players and devices and between the game world and the real world, right? And then I kind of added the blue boxes that you see to think about how what we do is a lot like scientific activity. And, I think it's an ugly diagram, but I'm hoping this will help to show you where you can intervene, like where we can make a difference. And, sorry, I should explain. So the x-axis is kind of between operators or players and machines, and I put designers on this side because you have a big influence on what's being done on this side. And then the y-axis is between the diegetic game world inside the game and the non-diegetic world, aka in real life, right? Okay, so I'll just go through this really one by one. So in quadrant 1, right, diegetic operator, this is really where most game stuff happens. When we think about playing games, that's really where it's happening, right? And most of the stuff that I wrote about in my book and also in this article for Art Journal, they're part of this quadrant, right? This is intervening on the level of game content. And, I know there's a lot here and you can't kind of capture it all, but I'll share slides. Just to give some examples, right? So like games should support, number 5, a wider range of player environment interaction. Well, one example I would give is, the so-called walking simulators. I don't know if there's a different term in French for this one. It's not like jeu de randonnée, is it? What is it? It is? Oh, okay. Wonderful. I'm learning. Melissa Kagan actually calls them wandering games. She has a book coming out called Wandering Games. But I like these because really it's about just observation and open-ended exploration. This is Adam Robinson Yu's A Short Hike. I mentioned USC before. They made the game Walden, which is based on a very famous piece of nature writing by Thoreau in the mid-19th century. Oh, I have to walk over. Can you hit play on the video? There we go. So maybe mute it so I can talk over, sorry. So this game is, I don't know if you know Walden, but you basically play as Thoreau did when he was living by himself on the shores of Walden Pond. So you build a one-room cabin in the woods, and you spend a lot of time sort of just being in nature and thinking. And the funny thing about this game is that if you do too much menial labor, like work for wages, you actually can pass out. You can't die. And then the colors of the world get very gray and drab. But if you spend time reading for pleasure and watching nature and just being in nature, the colors of the game are very rich and rosy and make you feel happier. So they tried to embed that mechanic. Okay. All right. And then, going back to that list that I just put up, there are games that definitely do more than one of those things, and this is one of them. You might have seen Luxuria Superbia by Tale of Tales. I love this game. But in this game, if you haven't played it, you're basically traveling down like the trumpet of a flower, and it's based for touch screens, and you're using your hands to basically give pleasure to the flower. And you have to do it at the right pace. Does it sound like something that you know? You can't go too fast or the flower will climax too quickly and you will get a poor score. So I think this game is really funny and it's kind of embarrassing when my students play it. They're like, whoa, what is this? That's not what they're expecting, right? So it's surprising, but it also is about the agency of something that's very different from us, right? It's about the flower and what the flower needs. And like, what are you doing to make that better? And, like I said before, we have a tendency to have plant blindness, like we're just kind of ignore vegetation, right, around us. And this game really kind of opens your eyes to that. All right, and then here, there's 5 more. I'm sorry to kind of throw these at you, but, in this one, we could take things like scale and number 8 about taking us outdoors. And we could think about games like Animal Crossing, right? Or Cozy Grove. I spent way too many hours on this game. But this new genre of cozy games, which I think are really interesting, they take us out of doors, so to speak, right? You could also talk about games that are using augmented reality or mixed reality applications to take you physically out of doors. I do think that's interesting. But these games are also kind of taking you outdoors, but they're also making it at a very manageable and comfortable scale. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both of these take place on islands. And so they're making it cozy, right, for you. And I think I had mentioned this in my interview with Xserve earlier, but I once advised a group of environmental master's students. They wanted to use a game that was not digital to teach kids about their environments, and they wanted to do it outside. And then we didn't know what this would be, but they finally came up with this brilliant idea, which was to do outdoor escape rooms, right? And you think, what is that? The whole point of an escape room is usually you get locked into a room, right? But they really came up with a way to do this outside, and I think it's kind of brilliant. And it makes you think differently about what games are and what escape rooms are. Okay, and then we could also, maybe if we have time later, we could talk about VR. There's a video, but I'm just gonna skip it. I'll just skip it. This is a video, if you don't mind hitting play. And then the last one that was on that list might have been surprising. It was games should help us mourn or to kind of grieve the loss of things that are kind of leaving us or leaving our planet, right? And I think this is a game that was made, oh, it's not playing. Sorry. There we go. It was made in just a few days by Mike Wren for an Indiecade climate game jam a few years ago where I was one of the game jam mentors. It didn't win any awards, but I think it's actually really quite amazing. And it was back at the start of the pandemic when, I don't know if you remember, but bats were kind of being, like people were pointing the fingers at bats as being maybe the origin point of the virus, instead of blaming things like human destruction of habitat or wet markets or human practices. People were kind of like looking at bats like, oh no, these wild animals gave us the virus. And so this game really makes you think about things. You're playing as a bat and you're kind of having this lovely life, but then you'll see in the background there's like a bulldozer that shows up and starts to destroy your habitat. You can actually click forward maybe if you don't mind. Just, yeah. No, click ahead in the video, sorry. If you go a little bit ahead, you'll see that their habitat gets totally destroyed, and then somebody actually comes and puts you in a cage and then takes you to the city to a wet market, right? And so there's kind of I think this is a game that kind of helps you to grieve or to mourn the loss of something, right? Many different things, yeah. Okay. All right. And all of that was quadrant one. So there's just a lot of stuff you can do with actual gameplay, but I do want to hit these other quadrants. So two is, machines in the game world. And for Galloway, the person who came up with this originally, he put stuff like ambient acts in here. So think about like, are there games where you can just put the controller down and the game world keeps going? And I think about things like Breath of the Wild, right? Weather in Breath of the Wild. So I love that kind of like, I can just put the controller down and just enjoy what's happening, right? But I think this is also a section where we could talk about the things that you can do before players have even touched your game, right? And let me just get past that, sorry. So this is happening on the machine end of things. And so I would include here things like development or design and art decisions that go into game making, right? And this is happening at the level of game engines or asset libraries. And I've been doing a lot of research recently on how 3D modelers model natural things like plants, right? And basically, how do digital assets come to be the way that they are? Are they just kind of made as a whole thing that you just stick in, or is it something that actually can develop and exhibit its own tendencies? And so you might know there are a lot of companies that will sell you these digital plants for your games, like Xfrog or Pixel Squid. The most famous one is probably SpeedTree. Whoops. SpeedTree is everywhere in most AAA games and a lot of quality television and film. And I think it actually really matters whether or not these game companies are also interested in plants themselves and botanical principles and science. And it makes a difference. There's a German company started by research computer scientists called Laubwerk, which means foliage. And this is a scene that they created, but they very much think about both computer science and botany to create their landscapes. And I think that's really interesting. So for me, it's less about visual realism than about developmental realism or behavioral realism. Like I want more games where plants actually grow and where they die, where they have, where they respond to things like light or obstacles or touch, right? If you want to get into a fight with a botanist, ask them if plants are fractals. Because that's the way most plants are modeled. Most trees and plants are modeled, right? So I'll just skip past that. All right, and then just to give an example, I talked about Firewatch earlier. I love this game, so I feel bad kind of pointing this out. But the art designer would say the same thing. But even though there are thousands of trees in this game, there are only 23 actual models of trees that have been cut and pasted across the landscape. And then once you see that, you can't unsee that. So just for this example, there's this one tree that has these little broken snags at the bottom, and it's made, that makes it unique and makes it feel like, oh, this is a special tree that you wouldn't see. But then, there it is, there it is, there it is. So once you see that, you can't play the game in the same way anymore. At least I can't, right? So it kind of destroys my immersion, in an interesting way. Okay. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that increasingly, I think the nature that we see and the nature that our children see, right, is this, right? And does it make a difference if all that they're seeing is generated purely for aesthetics, or does it also incorporate some kind of fidelity to the real world, right? Okay, going back to the diagram. So this third quadrant of machine non-diegetic is where Galloway would talk about things like server lag or glitches, right, that happen. But this is where I would say we can talk about infrastructure again, right, the ecology of games and how we can make production a little bit better. Before I had talked about cloud gaming, but I think here we can talk about climates and everything from really small scale climates like the heat generated by our computers or crypto, whatever, we could talk about this. All the way up to the climate of regions and the planet. And And this is really to start thinking about how really, I think we kind of take for granted that video games aren't impacted by climate, but that's going to change if it hasn't changed already. And then the kind of predictor of this is sports. I don't usually talk about sports, but I will say, golf courses are already being consumed by rising waters. Ice arenas are melty. They melt even during championship games when they're held in places like Las Vegas in the desert. There are all these sports stadiums for American football and for soccer, that have had to spend millions of dollars installing or retrofitting with shade canopies, because it's too hot to play in them or to sit in them and be a spectator now. And even for stadiums that have just been built. And so this is kind of like our new reality. And I know apparently the French are very into soccer. So you might be interested to know FIFA, right? The World Championship is in Qatar this year, and they had to move the championship from the summer to the winter because it would just be too hot, right? And FIFA also started to do cooling breaks for players, which they never had to do before this past decade. So these are these new realities that are creeping into sports and costing millions of dollars, but I don't think video games are exempt from this. Oh, I forgot, there's also the Winter Olympics, right? So this is a researchers who were studying the countries in blue that usually host the Olympics. Well, many of them will no longer be able to reliably host the games anymore because of changing climate conditions. And so, and this isn't just about, is there enough snow, but it's actually about the quality, the fairness, and the safety of these games, right? It's dangerous to have uneven ice conditions, right? It's unfair. Like in the Sochi games in Russia, the people who won were usually in the first 10 to ski or to snowboard on a course, right? So this is like fundamentally changing the nature of play, which I think is really interesting, and I think it's also coming for us in video games. And I was going to say that book that I talked about, Digital Games After Climate Change, Ben Abraham actually starts that book by saying, he tells a story from his childhood in Australia. He used to have a room upstairs where it got really hot. And in the summertime, which is really hot in Australia, he would have to decide, okay, am I going to play for hours on my computer? Because it's going to make my room so hot. And then I won't be able to sleep at all. And then as a teenager, he just played anyway, because it was more important to him. But he shares that story because he's trying to say that may not be an option in the future. You might have to choose to run your air conditioning or to run your PlayStation, right? Or you may not be able to do it at all. Okay. And then the last quadrant, this is operator, so back in the world of people and also the real world. And this is obviously, we're coming full circle to, I think, how we can actually take some of these ideas and put them into action in the world. You might have heard of Playing for the Planet. It's an alliance that was started after the UN Climate Summit in 2019, where they started the Playing for the Planet initiative. And this is actually an alliance of game companies that have made voluntary commitments to certain sustainability goals, right? Like Microsoft says it's going to be carbon negative by 2030. And if you look at their list, it's actually like there are huge companies on here like Microsoft and Unity, but there are also really tiny companies on here that are known for their storytelling and their games, like the indigenous media, Eline Media. Oh, okay. And also, it's not on here, but Strange Loop Games and Us Two Games, so much smaller scale studios are on there as well, and I would encourage you to join this. And also, I'll just put in a plug for the International Game Developers Association, which is kind of like it's for you all to have representation and to be able to network. But part of it is they just started a climate special interest group, which I am a part of, and has been very, very active. And they have all sorts of like wonderful volunteer organizers and work streams. They have presented advocacy talks at GDC. And then we also just recently published an alpha version of this, the Environmental Game Design Playbook, which is, oh gosh, like 80 pages of like tactics that you can actually employ in game design and examples of games that you can then use as to model something on. So I know I'm running on, so I just want to wrap up by saying, Richard Bartle is a famous MMO designer, and he has this quote in Designing Virtual Worlds about how it's just too much work to give everything meaning in a game. Obviously, we have limited resources. We can't do everything. And that's why we have a lot of games where you can't pull up the grass or you can't chop down trees. But I'm asking you to say, well, maybe we should have a game where you can pull up the grass, right? And maybe in return for that, we will have a game where you don't shoot things or you don't, there are trade-offs. So we can think about like, what are we choosing to invest our energy in? Is it physics of destruction and collision? Is it conglomeration and building? Is it just about survival, or is it also about joy? Is it about protest, sacrifice, right? What are the other kinds of things that we can model, right? And I'll just say, there's a lot of interest in this topic right now. And so if your players aren't already asking you and kind of pushing for this, I would expect it to come soon. I get a lot of interest in this, not just from developers, but also journalists from around the world, nonprofit organizations, mental health organizations, museum curators, artists. There's a lot of room here to make a mark. And I'll just end with this quote because I love it, which is Robin Wall Kimmerer's. She's actually a botanist, but she reminds us that play isn't optional. It's not secondary or frivolous. It's actually the way that we get limbered up for the work of the world, right? And I love that, right? It's not something secondary or gratuitous. It's actually how we have the capacity to keep on going and to make a difference. All right, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for questions. I hope everyone's brave. You can say it in French if you want. I'll try my best. Yeah, right.
Je peux traduire si vous avez des questions en français.
I think somebody, oh, you got it. I don't hear it. Oh, I didn't have to stay there. I didn't see this cord. I was stuck the whole time. Maybe one of, oh.
Hello, and thank you for this talk. That was very interesting. I think that's something that might be really interesting as well in terms of ecological video games would be to talk about ARG, alternate reality games, which take part in the video game on computer or anything, but takes place in the real world as well. And that could be a good way to make people go outside and find something about our world using a different world.
You were saying AR, right? Augmented reality?
ARG, alternate reality.
Oh, alternate reality games. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if you thought about this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to have your thought on that.
Yeah,
basically.
actually one of the most famous ARG designers graduated from the same program that I went to at Berkeley. Jane McGonigal, you maybe have heard about. She wrote the book Reality is Broken and also had the game Super Better. Yeah, I think a lot of those are really powerful because of human involvement, because they have puppet masters that are guiding the experience of play. And I think, that's one way. It's more like LARPing, right? Like live action role playing, and only certain people will gravitate to that. So I'm kind of like at this point in the climate crisis, I feel like we have to do everything. So it's like not this or that, but it's let's do this and that and that and that. So we'll do the, mainstream games and indie games and AR games and mixed reality and ARGs, whatever works, right? As long as we can use that to make a difference. Yeah, but I think those are interesting. I thought you were going to say AR, and it's funny because I play one of the Niantic games. The most recent one is Pikmin Bloom, where they took Pikmin and you just. So I've been walking around Rennes. Like yesterday, I went up to the park, and so I've been playing. But everyone always plays that with the augmented reality turned off because it's annoying and it takes so much energy, right? So it's just kind of funny because, that's supposed to be its special selling feature, but people turn it off for energy reasons, right? And also because, it just takes time, and it actually takes you away from your immediate surroundings. And that's why VR, I'm a little bit not sure about, because when you do VR, at least right now, you're kind of stuck in one place. And it also means you can't pay attention to the people around you, which I think is kind of a loss, really. So yeah, thinking about context of play is hugely important. And also, like you're saying, social play, I think, is also really important, because if we're going to, all these climate problems, all of our problems are collective action problems, right? So it's like learning how do you leverage the strength of weak ties, right? So it's not just like activism, but also how do you create something out of relatively small scale action and loose connection, because that's also possible. Yeah. Great question.
Hi, and thank you for this really great lecture. I had a question about the way we show nature inside video games, and the fact that it's always like great and wonderful nature, that is really strong and nothing can happen to it. And maybe that can become enough for some players that play it and think that this is how nature is, and
yeah.
which is not the reality. Like
Yeah.
some people that do documentary now don't want to show nature as wonderful and beautiful, and want to show the impact of climate change on it, and don't want to display this fantastic nature that people that live into cities take for granted and think, oh, it's like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we deal with that, how we show nature, and how weak it can be also.
That's a really wonderful observation, because before I worked on video games, I was actually obsessed with nature documentaries like BBC, David Attenborough, that kind of stuff, but they never show people in those documentaries, right? And so, we study this as academics. Like we like to show beautiful, untouched nature, but nothing is untouched at this point, right? There are radioactive particles everywhere on Earth, and plastics, microplastics everywhere on Earth, even places that we haven't touched, right? And so I think that's right. Like we need to show nature that's not just beautiful, pristine wilderness, but also nature in cities, right? In our urban places. I'm actually reading a book right now by my colleague, Peter Alagona, that's called The Accidental Ecosystem, and is talking about how cities are now the place where you can find a lot of wild animals. Like they've come back to cities after being out of them for a while. And so, yeah, we need to show, but that's why I think games are perfect, because when you talk to an environmentalist or to like an environmental activist and say, we should really be using video games, they give you the evil eye, right? Like we're very suspicious of electronics. Like immediately they just don't even include that in their toolkit because they think it's the enemy, right? But I think it's missing the point, right? Is that we can gain a lot from not thinking that nature and technology are totally separate, right? And if we're going to use technology, then to use it to have more sophisticated representations of nature, right? And also, the other thing that made me think of is that, especially in the United States, nature is not always a safe or comforting place for people. Like I think of African Americans, where like for them, like the woods is going to be more associated with histories of racial violence, right? And lack of safety rather than like I'm communing with the trees, right? Like I'm having a spiritual experience in the woods, right? Which is a very elite activity or leisure activity, right? So that's another reason I think we can't ignore games, because not everyone is comfortable with that kind of like experience, right? Like having to go into the wild to have an experience, right? That's transforming you. Oh yeah.